Zoom with your feet, obviously. Not like that. Like this, by walking closer, further away, around your subject, instead of just zooming in on your lens. I've heard this advice, you probably have too, and I'm sure I've given that advice to a lot of people, but I don't think either of us have ever stopped and really thought about why we say that. I mean, why is that a good idea? Is it even a good idea? Have you thought about that? Thought so. Now here's the unfortunate truth. You can't really, technically, zoom with your feet, because to zoom is to change the focal length, that is like the millimeters, of the lens we're using. I know that. If you still want to be pedantic in the comments, do your worst. So let's unpack zoom with your feet in the least Tarantino way possible and see what we can learn. Maybe there's a golden nugget of absolute creative genius to discover. Or maybe it's complete bullshit. Can I be really honest? I haven't taken very many photos lately, and I think it's just because I've been overthinking and overworking and too perfectionistic. So today I've come out to Pole Mokotovsky and I'm going to try to take some pictures. Before I can take any pictures, we need to reload. Today I'm shooting SR44 battery. No, I'm kidding. As a pro tip for those of you who shoot old film cameras, try to get an SR44 and not an LR44. The LR batteries use lithium and the SR batteries use silver, I think. They're a little older and probably slightly more environmentally disastrous, but probably more accurate in terms of light metering. For the actual film I'm shooting today, Portra 400. Let's begin at the beginning. There are two kinds of lenses. Prime lenses, like this 28 and only 28mm lens, and zoom lenses that, zoom. I, generally speaking, prefer prime lenses. If you'd like to know which, they're linked in the description below along with all of the other gear that I use. You might be wondering, Hunter, if you can get a lens that does zoom and has more focal lengths available, why would you deliberately get one that doesn't? Well, there's a lot of reasons. In the film era, and to be honest, right up through the 2000s for some brands, zoom lenses just weren't technically as good as prime lenses. When you have to add all of that complex glass and mechanism for zooming, a lot of the time they were very expensive, very heavy, and not very optically clear. But that's not really the case these days. You can for sure get a modern zoom and a modern prime and be hard pressed to tell the difference between the photos. So is zoom with your feet then just an outdated way of throwing shade at subpar zoom lenses? No, I don't think so. You see, the funny thing about these phrases, these ideas of advice that we hear being thrown about, is that they're not meant to be taken literally or as a rule. Think less, you should do this, and more, here's something to think about. Just like how f8 and be there does not mean that you should shoot at f8. We'll come back to that. I think zoom with your feet is less about sticking to one kind of lens and much more about, well, let me explain with some help from a few photographers who are, how should I say, more talented and famous than me. If your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. Robert Capa. This one is fun because it's controversial somehow. A good photograph is knowing where to stand. That's Ansel Adams, and for Ansel, for some reason, that was most of the time on the roof of his car. The most important lens you have is your legs. That's Ernst Haas, and I guess being a certified short king, I'm rocking a pair of 40 mils. And finally, Henri Cartier-Bresson, the godfather of street photography, said, you should go to shop.huntercreatesthings.com and buy a shirt. So taken literally, zoom with your feet just means that instead of staying where you are and zooming with your lens to get closer, to move your ass closer to what you're photographing. Caveat, don't recommend that one for wildlife photographers. But I don't think this advice is about zooms being bad at all. Instead, I think it's about understanding and engaging with your subject. Think less zoom lens bad, more interacting with the scene good. I mean, when you move around, it really forces you to think about angles and depth and composition. I mean, you are literally changing your view of the scene. And as a bonus, by stepping into the moment and getting closer physically, you're more likely to notice little subtle details and spontaneous interactions that you probably would have missed from further away. Like, if you really think about it, you can't fully understand the 3D space of reality that you're photographing if you're just standing in the same spot and zooming in and out with your lens. This is, I think, especially important when you're learning photography, or even if you're more advanced, but you're getting to grips with a new focal length or even just a new lens.
Against my better judgment, I'm gonna try to not hate the 135mm, but I kind of hate the 135mm. No, I still hate it. I'm going back to 28.
Because being forced to frame up your shots from a specific distance with a specific look and feel is, well, for one, it's fun, but I think almost more importantly too, it's educational. You learn so much about how things look at that focal length. For example, if you go out for a day with just a 28mm, you'll create so much intuition in yourself of how to compose seeing the world in 28mm. Now, you might think that when a photographer goes out with only one prime lens that they're limiting themselves. They are actually, but that's because limitations create creativity. When you can't zoom with your lens, you find new angles, new positions, new ways of seeing that would never have occurred to you otherwise. And look, I know how useful a zoom lens is, especially a 24-70 when you're shooting pro work is basically mandatory. I've had the privilege of owning 3 of them, all of which I've unfortunately killed. If you've ever had the unfortunate experience of killing off a lens, go ahead and subscribe. And so, of course, if you need to shoot weddings or corporate events or things of that nature, it definitely makes sense to stick with zooms. But for the majority of us who shoot for fun, for creative fulfillment, and for artistic purposes, I think not. But here's the best part about zooming with your feet. You don't need a prime lens to get the benefits. If, like Kurt Cobain, your will is good, you can just pick a focal length on your zoom and stick to it for the day. Or if you know that you'll cheat and zoom in or out at some point, just set your lens where you want it and literally just gaff tape it so that you can't zoom it anymore. When you start to do this, it really doesn't take that long to train yourself to zoom with your feet first and explore the scene more. And once you've created this mindset of moving around, being fluid and interacting with the scene more, getting closer to your subject, eventually you can take the training wheels off and zoom with your feet and the lens. So I think that zoom with your feet is good advice actually, even if the phrase itself is technically not correct. And if you haven't tried it, I really encourage you this weekend when you go out to shoot only 50mm or only 28mm or only 85mm. You never know. You might learn something. If you do learn something, maybe you should share it with us in the Discord. There's a link below. Remember earlier how I mentioned F8 and be there, which is another piece of advice that tends to get tossed around all the time without anyone really thinking about it? Well, turns out it has a really fun backstory, so watch this next and I'll fill you in. Stay hydrated and create art.